Thank you, Katya and Iliana, to inviting me to the presentation here in the frames of CPC talk, and thank you, Arnold Bartecki, to introducing me to this formula of the project, the CPC talk. And today I would like to talk about somehow very comprehensive, compound, and multi-leveled topic, which is post-reconstruction in Poland, with the main focus on north and western territories. So I was wondering how to talk about this comprehensive topic. Initially, I wanted to focus only on my own studies, but then I realized that maybe it would be better to give some short historical introduction to what has happened in terms of post-war reconstruction in Poland. So finally, we will have three parts and some general conclusions. So now let me move to the first part, which will be somehow the introduction to the topic. So we have to be aware that after the Second World War, Polish territory has changed significantly. It shifted from east to west, and Poland lost some territories in east, which from Polish perspectives can be described as lost territories. And in the west, those pre-war German areas incorporated to Poland after the war sometimes are called recovered or regained territories, or northern and western territories. So I wanted to introduce this topic because I will be using those terminology and those changes of political borders has a quite a significant repercussions, because on the one hand there was the great migration movement. So the German had to leave the territories, and the new settlers came to this territory. And it also meant that the country after the war hasn't been homogeneous. It was rather a heterogeneous state, and one of the biggest challenges was to unify those new territories and to resettle the war migrants, which influenced very strongly the shape and directions and the tempo of the post-war reconstruction in northern and, well, simply incorporated territories. We, we shall also say something about the scale of destruction, which was unprecedented. So in the incorporated territories, there were about 300 towns and cities, including about 250 with little damage. But after the front, more than 177 cities and towns were destroyed in more than 50%. So its average estimation of the destruction scale 53%. So it caused huge, significant problems in the recovered territories and the so-called old lands, because it was the scale of the destruction was unprecedented and required a huge amount of human work resources and greater organizational effort. And in the post-war communist state, the responsibility of the reconstruction lay down on the Ministry of Reconstruction, but also from 1945, the new Ministry of so-called recovered territories was in charge for development and economic integration of the country with those territories. But it wasn't an easy process because we were witnessing a very harsh socio-economic situation, that territory is very unstable political situation with still some borders being shifted, and also some other topics like removal of traces of German culture, failure to undertake the security and the renovation works in damaged buildings, and lack of concern for the aesthetic appearance of the cities, limited resources, poorly conducted cleaning and debris removal works, and many of the tenements, the buildings were destroyed also after the war, not only because of the war by itself. And there was also an Act number 666, the Government Presidium, on matters relating to planned removal of war damage in cities and housing estates. So it caused some significant destruction as well. And also in the first period after the war, the regained territories that incorporated to Poland, they were also used as a source of collecting good quality constructing materials. For example, this brick with the name of Stettin, yes, so we know the origin, was found during the reconstruction, sorry, the renovation works in Palace of Science and Culture in Warsaw. This is how it used to be. And now let me shift a bit to some phases of post-war reconstruction process. Of course, we got different divisions due to varied scholars, but here I would like to present some periodization prepared by Professor Lubocka Hoffman. So first phase, sometimes called as described as a Polish conservation school of monuments, mostly focused on historical or historically inspired reconstruction. Then a very short phase of trial of harmonizing the new development with the old pre-war urban tissue. The next stage, the longest one, with more than 200 old towns across the whole country, adopted this principles of that phase, and finally from the 80s, from the beginning of the 80s, the retroversion phase. Professor Boska sometimes is giving some other another period, which is called Without Roots, but with illusion of creating something new and valuable after 1985. She called this way sometimes first 15 years of transformation. And also, from my perspective, we can distinguish at least some sub-period of revalorization and revitalization after joining the European Union, and we are still somehow grounded in this period from my perspective. And in here we can see some selected examples of the division for the different direction of post-war reconstruction, due to Professor Szmygin and Przewęcki. So the first and very short and sharp, but also somehow related to the periodization of the post-war transformation division, due to Professor Szmygin distinguish historical reconstruction, more or less faithful modernist style of reconstruction, and retroversion from the 80s. And Professor Przewęcki has a bit different approach, giving the reconstruction of destroyed buildings, and then the neointegration, which is mostly based on modernism, conditional restructuring, like building new urban complexes influenced by some historical determinants such as scale, dimensions, forms, or roof shape, or the location of the building, but with more or less preserved urban plan, but without following any particular historical style and also excluding some modern architectural forms. And the retroversion, sorry, the revalorization for the less destroyed, dilapidated cities and towns. So soon after the war, the avant-garde modernist architectures and urban planners were somehow fighting with the conservatory environment, but in the first phase, Professor Zachwatowicz and the historically inspired approach won the battle. So, because of the great deliberate destruction of the monuments of the state, he decided that even knowing that he will create somehow the falsificate, he decided to reconstruct a couple of the most important and historically valuable old town areas in Poland, starting, of course, with Warsaw. Old Town Reconstruction awarded in 1980. And I think it was also the honorable for whole the process of Polish post-reconstruction. And up to date, it's only the one UNESCO listed in Poland territory thanks to post-reconstruction, but maybe in the nearest future it will change. We will see because there are another proposals from another cities. Mm, but of course, not only Warsaw was reconstructed as a whole urban project, was also the reconstruction of Gdańsk. It wasn't a faithful reconstruction. This is what we shall remember. And in Gdańsk, it was much bigger territory with about 1,200 tenement houses. The scale, the challenge was significant, and here by the comparison of the pre-war plan with the highly congested urban plots and the post-war plans for the reconstruction, we can see the clear differences, not only in terms of the in the urban scale, but also in terms of the architectural scale. The same period and somehow similar processes took place in Wrocław, even a bigger territory with about 1,600 tenements. But sometimes this historically inspired reconstruction meant that the front facades became the curtains obscuring the new flats. So the historical facade was covering some modern approach. Also, the changes in proportions of the building, size of windows, and then the layout, some simplification in architectural details, and some other aspects which are mm, claiming that it's not the pure faithful pre-war reconstruction. It wasn't possible, absolutely. And some other examples, like in here in Olsztyn or in other city in Opole, and sometimes in the second stage cities, if we can see that a bit smaller ones. There was some kind of falsification produced by giving the two-storied houses, just giving one more level because of the prestigious and economic reasons, and also sgraffito was used for decorative reasons, very often Baroque finials, and even the arcades for the townhouses, which never existed in those places, were used just to because of some ideological reasons, trying to search or create a bit more Polish or Slavian style of the reconstructed or rebuilt old town territory. And the second phase, very short one, with the example in here in Javor, where we can see the partially preserved pre-war urban tissue and some trial to harmonize the modern building, giving the arches in here and in this part of the market square. So trying to harmonize it, but it soon appeared that it is too expensive and too slow, and hunger for flats was too huge. So there was a very quick shift to the modernist approach, and in the third modernist stage, starting from the more or less from the 60s, we can say that urban planners and architects started to play the leading role, and in the previous stages, the conservatory service has a bit more to say. So now that the biggest focus was on producing as cheap and as fast as possible, because in here you can see the post-war demographical boom. So there was a great hunger of flat, and the panel, large prefabricated panels were used in the whole country um, to see those needs for large number of houses. And thanks to this process, we received a completely different shape than in comparison to the pre-war situation in the many old town territories. Here is, for example, Malbork, with a very fine neighborhood of the Teutonic castle listed on the UNESCO list. So it's a very big contrast between those two historical parts of the city, of the complex. So because it was the longest period and involved the most investment, it had some very huge significant impact on the value and image of many old towns. So they've lost their historical shape and atmosphere, and hundreds of historic towns have been stripped of their individual character due to this process. And finally, the retroversion phase. In here we can see Elbląg, where it started. So the city was destroyed almost completely. I mean, the old town territory, and through the first decades after the war, the former densely built up territory served as a inner meadow, or the wasteland, the urban wasteland. But in the 80s, in 1983, Professor Maria Lubowska-Hoffman proposed the conservatory program for the rebuilding this old town territory, and it is characterized by the large-scale interdisciplinary scientific research preceding the construction work, the most accurate possible reconstruction of the urban plan, and contemporary architectural forms of new tenement houses built exactly on the medieval foundations, and somehow restoration of the central and representative functions of the old town. So these were the main features of this attitude. And we, of course, have the example of Elbląg, but also in Głogów. In both cities, the reconstruction is still going on, but we also have some the retroversion approach, some elements in Stargard, Olsztyn, Szczecin, Kołobrzeg, or Legnica, or other cities. So now let me move to second part of the presentation, which will be focused on some big and the smallest cities comparison. So when talking about largest cities in the incorporated northwestern territories of Poland, here you can see them marked on the map with the red color. The first step was to analyze the general directions of reconstruction of those cities, then to find the most representative case studies, and finally, the study was dedicated to four cities, all of them densely built before the war with the high congestion ratio of the urban plot, but then after the war with some significant changes. So the first step after choosing the case studies was to find the pre-war old maps and plans of those cities and then establish the age of the each building in the old town territory. So I proposed a simple division for pre-war, the people's, well, let's say the post-war Poland until the transition period and after 1989. So somehow it is visible already on those graphs which city was destroyed in a bigger proportion. So the next step was to compare some basic spatial morphological metrics of those cities. So somehow the quantitative approach and using the Schwarz plans or overlaying those maps on themselves, we can see how significant the changes were. And in the table below, you can see some data. So not only the percentage of built-up area has significantly changed, like in Gorzów or in Elbląg, but also the number of buildings because of different approaches to the reconstruction. Then the phase of somehow the qualitative study began with trying to assess the direction of of post-war reconstruction of those built-up area. And here is the proposition of classification of the buildings from those historical old towns by using different methodology, except some local studies, study of documentation from the Conservatory Service, from National Heritage Institute, and of course some iconography, archival iconography, and cartography. So it was a bit challenging, but finally, as a final stage, we could distinguish some models of post-war reconstruction of those cities. So we got the model with dominant original urban tissue represented here by Bytom, with the rather orthomorphic, some minimal modifications because of the relatively low scale of the destruction, with some filling-ins of some historizing modernism or some simply modern or postmodern shape of the buildings. The second style or type of the or direction of reconstruction is model of historizing reconstruction. Yeah, somehow it can be called the historicization. Like in here represented by Olsztyn with significant destruction, and where the main aim was to restore the historical character of the territory. And reconstruction focus was on the new townhouses, but referenced somehow to historical pattern, but without the pure faithful reconstruction. And another model, it was the neo-integration or the modernist approach, following the principles of modernism and construction with modernist residential blocks. So it was relatively easy to conduct in the cities destroyed in the bigger proportion, and having more or less carte blanche, we can start the history of this part of the city from scratch. So we can write it due to our own vision. And the last one example of Elbląg, the retroversion with a trial of some kind of the historically inspired reconstruction with some new sanitary standards and using the um, postmodern or simplified historical forms with using present-day materials, but with the buildings strictly lay down the fundamentals of the old pre-war buildings. So here on this slide, we can see somehow some kind of the axis and those different cities stretched on those two axes between memory and oblivion, and between conservation and new development approach. So both of this axis refers to the ideological and morphological factors that determine the post-war reconstruction process. I don't want to be too detailed in here. I think it's understandable and clear. So now, as a contrary, please let me say a few words about the smallest towns and cities, which in Polish conditions is understood as towns smaller than 20,000 residents, inhabitants. And in present day, Warmińsko-Mazurskie Voivodeship, we have now 50,000 cities due to administrative division and demographical population division. And 18 of them were destroyed in more than 70% during the war, so high ratio of destruction because it was the first German territory met by the Red Army going by the front going to the Berlin direction. So the scale of the destruction is significant, and we excluded the Iława from here because it's bigger than 20,000. So finally, the study was focused on three different case studies: Węgorzewo, Lubawe, and Kisielice. And of course, the first step to choose those case studies was to analyze all of those small towns and old towns in those centers in terms of the scale and character of morphological transformation. Yes, and then the next step was to choose the best case studies. In here, the study involved also some basic socio-economic indicators, the metrics, because in small towns like in here, having 11 or 10 or 2,000 inhabitants, it's very important, and it will appear in the later slides why those factors are important, because not only the peripheral location from the biggest administrative and economic centers in Poland played a role in here, but also the demography and the population and relatively low economic power also is influencing mostly at present the problems and the consequences of post-war spatial and functional transformation. I proposed for the small towns the methods of graph analysis. I will not present here the GDP, the Graph Development Index, because it's simply visible in here by comparing them with our bare eyes. So we can see that those cities lost their spatial continuity in the old town territories, like in Węgorzewo, or even more visible, like in Kisielice. This town is still not reconstructed in this formerly old town territory. So here we can see the loss of the continuity. And if it's not visible in here, maybe this slide will show it maybe in a better way by giving the percentage of built-up area, the building footprints. Yeah, so we can see the scale of the destruction. This is how they look like. This is Węgorzewo and former Old Town area. Now it's modernist apartment blocks compound all together, more or less in the shape of the former Altmarkt, but only the maybe the name of the city, Zamkowa, the Castle Street, is saying something about the pre-war history of this territory. Here we can see Kisielice, which hasn't been rebuilt after the war. So only the church and few other buildings survived, and this whole territory was once before the war the very nicely looking small town with historic architecture. And here we got Lubawa, which is a bit different example because before the war, this town was Polish, so it means that there was no replacement of former inhabitants. So in the first post-war years, people could restore their own properties. Yes, they were locals. So thanks to it, we got somehow more or less harmonized shape of the post-reconstruction, even though pure modernist approach was used very often in here, but the general perspective creates the atmosphere of historical place, historical old town. So it is some kind of a hybrid method we can see. And in here some basic models of the reconstruction met in the small towns of the territory. So we have the reconstruction of the mixed type restructuring based model. We got a mixture of pre-war buildings and the post-war tenement houses or the buildings trying at least to keep the shape and the location of the pre-war built-up area. We have the neo-integration model with modernist approach, with lost cultural and landscape continuity, and also unbuilt or partially rebuilt model like in Kisielice, like Pieniężno, Pisztynek, Miłomun, some other cities from those territories. So it was the comparison between the biggest and the smallest cities and towns, and now a few words about the challenges and repercussions or long-term spatial functional consequences of those processes. So this is again Gorzów Wielkopolski. Here we can see of course, the modernist approach with the great artery, huge road dividing the former Old Town area into parts with some monumental architecture, like in here the church survived and the former old market square surrounding with such architecture. So we got the original temple and the temple of consumption, as I say, from the post-war modernist period facing each other. And two other aspects, very interesting one. Here, the monument of Bamberka destroyed during the war because the good quality material was used, and the local authorities recreated it in a faithful reconstruction after the war in the 90s, and some other aspects showing the hunger for heritage, as I call it. But in here in a rather pastiche form. So here we got the block of flat, the regular apartment like others in this territory, but with some new facade. So now the result is clearly visible, and the local authorities and people are wondering why we did it. Yes, and what can we do with this later? So that's very interesting. But here we can see that there's a hunger for heritage for the pre-war situation. In here, Malbork again, and the former Old Town area where only few pre-war buildings survived. And there were plans to destroy this territory and to rebuild it in a historically inspired shape. But the organizational tasks were too big, so finally it ended with building somehow the curtain, postmodern curtain, trying to cover this modernist old town territory. Here some example from Elbląg, which is the first city having this scale of retroversion, where Professor Luboska Hoffman used to work and proposed and invented this method somehow. But still there is no, for example, the Museum of Retroversion style. And the tourist capacity is very limited for this old town. So there is still a lot to do, and also the territory of this rebuilt old town is somehow divided and not connected with other parts of the cities, also in terms of local transport. So here we are witnessing the somehow the process of recreating the city, the old town territory. So maybe in the next coming years or decades it will change. And here on the first plan we can see the part of the Granary Island with the postmodernist, uh, inspired by the former Granar built development. So the retroversion fundaments are now being forgotten, as I may say. And also this 30 or 40 or even 20 years old architecture, sometimes it's obsolete, especially from the backyards. So there's a lower standard from the facade street, everything is fine. Yeah, but at the back there is still a lot to do. So that's another problems and question of the balconies and the properties, ownership, etc. Another problem. Sometimes we can see maybe too many different colors, variations, and even the pastiche forms, like in Legnica or co-object, this postmodernist architecture. On the other hand, we got such example like in here in Kwidzyn, a lately reconstructed part of the former medieval market, which is very unified, simplified, and controversial in form somehow. And in biggest cities, like in Gdańsk, there is a great developers pressure. This is newly reconstructed or rebuilt, maybe better to say, granary in the island, northern part of it. So maybe for a short rental, those buildings are good, but living there for a whole life without a sun, it can be a big problem. So a bit bigger and maybe too congested architecture shows that there is a great demand of the square meters built in this territory. And in here again, Węgorzewo, which actually lost its center, lost its heart. We have those former Altmarkt, which is now the modernist style. Um, housing block estates, and we got totally empty with only some few shops, and you can see that's the middle of the day. No one is sitting here. The 19th century, formerly 19th century Neuermarkt, and those two areas, they are not playing their role, and this is the former Altmark. So if you ask the locals, where is the market, so it will be you will have a very different answers. Yes, and still you can see the significant ratio of empty plots inside the city center. So this is a huge problem for especially for such a small towns. And also we can say about some problems with revitalization process. Hopefully it will change because the new law regulations were adopted, giving much more power for the GPRs, czyli so it means commune revitalization programs. So hopefully it would be another more effective stage of the revitalization and revitalization. And the revitalization here in Węgorzewo somehow failed in some aspects. And here we got Kisielice. We already know this place unbuilt, but there are some plans for more than 20 years how to reconstruct it. But there is a problem for who we shall reconstruct this territory, because if the city or town rather has 2,000 inhabitants, half of the buildings restored will be empty, yes, for years or even a decade, because there will be no one to invest to them. And some other maybe challenge or maybe some signum temporis, the growing, from my perspective, hunger for heritage. These are some results of the survey made in this year in Elbląg by my students and myself, that people are claiming for the reconstructionism, yes, which is not only the case from here in Poland, but started much earlier, for example, in Germany. But generally speaking, there's a tension between the conservatory or urban planners environment and the local who are mostly who would like to see a more reconstructed buildings, and not only in such a small cities Elbląg, but also in Warsaw. There's a plan to reconstruct Saski Palace. In 5 years' time, we will see it reconstructed, probably. And example from Warmia Mazuria, like districts, showing that in smaller cities it can be a problem, because it's a reconstruction of the pre-war town hall. And for a few years after the reconstruction, this building was empty because there was no one to invest in there. Yes, and the city has more than 30,000 inhabitants. So sometimes we meet the socio-economic challenges. So just to conclude, because I already talking too long. So some general conclusions referring to post-reconstruction in Poland. So it was an extremely complex phenomenon, and I wanted only to touch some elements referring to this process. So it was maybe descriptive in nature, not to digging too deep. So we shall be also aware that it was the reinvasion of the nation state from heterogeneous territories after the war, because we got the old lands and the new territories. And also we shall be aware that there was after the war it was a socialist or communist system without Marshall Plan, without this support, and with taking over the private land ownership in many territories. So it was a different approach and different frames and possibilities to reconstruct than, for example, in Western Germany or in France or in other countries in Western Europe. And still, after 80 years, we can see that it's an ongoing process in Poland, not only in terms of the small town, but also in terms of bigger ones too. Some key findings of the detailed research. So regardless the nature of the reconstruction, we shall be aware that the post-war urban reconstruction was an opportunity to introduce the new sanitary standards, but of course in many different models and approaches, with original buildings, with historicization inspired by the historical shape, neo-integration and retroversion, but also we are having the hybrid models and non-reconstructed or partially reconstructed centers. And it is clearly visible that there was a priority for the large cities for the reconstruction, and small towns are still marginalized and they suffer the big challenges. And because mostly, but not only using the neo-integration approach, sometimes we are witnessing loss of cultural continuity and even spatial chaos, or at least dysfunctional complexes. And the last metroid slide, some selected challenges, just to sum up. So, from my perspective, there is a lack of a broader public debate about the consequences of post-war transformations and what we shall do now with this heritage of reconstruction, the spatial and functional and social challenges. Because in Poland, the matter of post-reconstruction was mostly physical and spatial issue, not like a restitution, giving back the destroyed private property, like for example in France or in Western Germany. So that's a great difference in here. And we are lacking the integrated urban policies. We are facing somehow the technical obsolescence in many, especially small towns. Of course, not everywhere, but it is a case in a global scale of the whole country. Some revitalization constraints, and maybe the biggest challenge is the socio-economic and demographic challenges, especially in the small towns and cities. So thank you very much for your attention. Sorry for being too for speaking too long, maybe. Thank you.